Hello, my friends. The reason this war has not ended is not because diplomacy is impossible, nor because Russia is unwilling to negotiate, but because the United States and its European auxiliaries have no strategic incentive to allow it to end. The conflict in Ukraine has become an instrument, not a problem to be solved. It is a mechanism through which power, money, political cover, and institutional survival are maintained across Washington, Brussels, and the NATO system. Publicly, American officials repeat the line that this is not America's war, that it is taking place on another continent, and that the United States merely has interests or equities involved. That framing is deliberately dishonest. A state that funds the war, arms one side, provides intelligence, operates command centers, and coordinates logistics is not a neutral observer. It is a participant. The only sense in which Washington claims neutrality is rhetorical, designed to preserve the illusion that it can act as a mediator while continuing to prosecute the war through proxies. The claim that the United States is the only actor capable of speaking to both sides is technically true but strategically perverse. It is true only because Washington has ensured that Europe is incapable of acting independently and because Ukraine itself is politically and financially dependent on American decisions. But mediation requires neutrality, and neutrality is precisely what the United States refuses to adopt. The posture of mediator is used not to end the conflict, but to manage it, to stretch it, and to extract value from it. This contradiction explains why ceasefire proposals repeatedly fail. Russia has made clear, repeatedly and consistently, that it is open to diplomacy, but not to theatrical ceasefires designed to freeze the battlefield while NATO rearms Ukraine. The Western demand for an unconditional ceasefire with security guarantees is, in practice, a demand that Russia stop fighting while Ukraine continues to receive weapons, money, and intelligence. No rational state would accept such terms, and Russia has not. There was, however, a moment when a framework existed. Discussions between Russian and American officials produced a basis for de-escalation, including difficult compromises on Russia's side. Those understandings were not rejected by Moscow. They were abandoned by Washington. The reason was not Russian intransigence, but internal Western politics. Pressure from NATO hardliners, European governments invested in escalation, and American political figures whose credibility depends on sustaining confrontation with Russia. The decision to walk away from that framework was deliberate. Once that happened, the rhetoric of diplomacy became little more than a public relations exercise. The financial architecture of the war reinforces this reality. So-called aid to Ukraine increasingly takes the form of loans that Ukraine will never realistically repay. The logic is almost absurd. Ukraine is told it will repay these loans when Russia compensates it, an outcome that presupposes a Russian defeat that no longer exists in any serious military assessment. Meanwhile, European taxpayers shoulder the interest burden, and vast sums are recycled back into Western defense contractors. The war functions as a transfer mechanism. Public money flows into the military-industrial complex while Ukraine accumulates debt and loses sovereignty. This structure also explains why Western officials openly speak about continued fighting into 2026 and beyond. Such statements are not slips of the tongue, they reflect planning assumptions. A war that ends is a war that stops generating political leverage, budget justifications, and institutional relevance. NATO, in particular, requires a permanent enemy to justify its existence. Without Russia, NATO has no organizing principle. Conflict is not a failure of the system. It is the system's fuel. On the battlefield, the reality contradicts Western messaging. Casualty exchanges tell a consistent story. Russia returns vastly more Ukrainian fallen soldiers than Ukraine returns Russian ones. This pattern has repeated for more than a year. It is not propaganda, it is arithmetic. It reflects which side is advancing and which is retreating. Analysts may attempt to obscure this fact with abstractions, but the numbers do not lie. A force that is advancing recovers more territory and inevitably more bodies. The strategic momentum is Russian. This momentum is also visible in operational preparations. Russian strikes against critical infrastructure in the Odessa region, including sustained efforts to neutralize key transit bridges, indicate systematic shaping operations. These are not symbolic attacks. They are designed to isolate regions, disrupt logistics, and prepare conditions for future military action. Odessa is not a rumor or speculation. It is a strategic objective whose significance is obvious to anyone who understands the geography and economics of the Black Sea. At the same time, Russia has signaled clear red lines. Discussions in NATO capitals about blockading or attacking Kaliningrad are not treated as idle chatter in Moscow. Russian leadership has stated unequivocally that such actions would trigger escalation on a completely different scale. This is not bluster. Kaliningrad is not Ukraine. It is Russian territory. Any attempt to sever or blockade it would collapse the remaining barriers between proxy war and direct conflict. Despite this, Russia continues to emphasize diplomacy, but diplomacy rooted in legitimacy. Moscow has made clear that any durable settlement requires a legitimate Ukrainian government. Elections suspended indefinitely under martial law produce a leadership whose legal mandate erodes over time. Russia has even indicated willingness to support elections under specific conditions, including guarantees that Ukrainian citizens residing in Russia be allowed to vote and that military activity pause on election day. These conditions are reasonable. They are also unacceptable to a Western-backed Ukrainian leadership that understands such elections could end its political survival. Western actions at sea further demonstrate the escalation logic. Attacks on oil tankers associated with Russia's energy exports are not random acts. They are part of an economic warfare strategy aimed at increasing insurance costs, disrupting shipping, and constraining revenue. Russia has acknowledged this openly and has warned that continued attacks will provoke retaliation. The idea that such actions can remain without consequence reflects either denial or deliberate risk-taking. Throughout all of this, Western narratives rely on caricatures, multiple versions of Russian leadership, shifting personas, supposed contradictions. These narratives serve to avoid confronting a simpler truth. Russian policy has been remarkably consistent. Russia seeks security on its borders, recognition of strategic realities, and an end to a NATO expansion project that it has warned against for decades. What changes is not Russia's position, but the West's willingness to acknowledge it. The war continues, not because peace is unattainable, but because peace is inconvenient. It would expose the failure of sanctions, the limits of military pressure, and the costs imposed on European societies. It would force a reckoning with the fact that Russia is not isolated, not collapsing, and not defeated. For institutions and individuals whose authority rests on denying those facts, prolonging the war is the safer option. Time, however, is not neutral. It favors the side with strategic depth, industrial capacity, and political cohesion. On all three counts, Russia holds the advantage. The longer this conflict drags on, the more it reveals the structural weakness of the Western approach. When the war eventually ends, it will not be because the West discovered diplomacy, but because reality imposed it. Beyond the battlefield and diplomacy, the Ukraine war must be understood as a systems-level project of the Western order, not a discrete military conflict. It is embedded in financial structures, energy flows, alliance politics, and internal regime preservation. When viewed this way, many actions that appear irrational at the tactical level become perfectly logical at the strategic and institutional level. Take Europe's role. The European Union is not acting as a sovereign geopolitical actor, but as an enforcement arm for decisions made elsewhere. European governments have accepted policies that directly harm their own industrial base, energy security, and social stability. Deindustrialization in Germany, soaring energy prices, shrinking competitiveness, and rising political fragmentation are not accidental side effects. They are accepted costs within a framework where loyalty to the Atlantic system is prioritized over national interest. The frozen Russian assets debate illustrates this dynamic clearly. While some European institutions flirt with the idea of seizing Russian assets outright, others hesitate, understanding the precedent it would set the moment frozen assets become confiscated assets. The credibility of the Western financial system collapses. Property rights cease to be universal and become conditional on political alignment. That realization explains why certain states quietly resist crossing that line. They understand that today it is Russian assets. Tomorrow, it could be theirs. This fear is not hypothetical. It is already reshaping global finance. States outside the Western Bloc are accelerating efforts to reduce exposure to dollar and euro-denominated systems. Energy trade increasingly bypasses traditional insurance and settlement mechanisms. The so-called shadow fleet is not an anomaly. It is a preview of a parallel economic architecture forming in response to weaponized finance. Every attack on a tanker, every insurance squeeze reinforces the incentive to operate outside Western control. The United States understands this, but it calculates that the short-term benefits of coercion outweigh the long-term erosion of its financial dominance. That calculation may prove to be the most consequential misjudgment of the entire conflict. Empires rarely collapse from a single defeat. They hollow out as the systems that sustain them lose trust. Militarily, the Western approach suffers from a similar contradiction. Ukraine is portrayed as defending itself, yet it is denied the political autonomy to pursue a settlement that reflects battlefield realities. Decisions about escalation, weapons systems, targeting permissions, and strategic objectives are not made in Kyiv. They are made in Washington, Brussels, and allied capitals. Ukraine absorbs the human cost, while others manage the narrative. This arrangement also explains the obsession with symbolism over substance. Announcements of new weapons deliveries, promises of aircraft at a later date, and vague security guarantees serve domestic political needs in the West far more than they alter the military balance. They create the appearance of resolve while avoiding the decisive escalation that Western leaders privately fear. The result is a grinding war of attrition that Ukraine is structurally ill-equipped to win. Russia, by contrast, has approached the conflict with a long war mindset from the beginning. Its economy has adapted, its defense production has scaled, its society, while not untouched, has absorbed the shock. Most importantly, Russia has framed the conflict as existential, not optional. That framing matters. States fight differently when they believe the stakes involve survival rather than prestige. The Western narrative struggles precisely because it cannot reconcile its own contradictions. Russia is described simultaneously as collapsing and dangerously expansionist, incompetent and yet capable of threatening NATO itself. These contradictions are not analytical failures. They are narrative necessities. They allow policymakers to justify both complacency and escalation depending on the audience. Meanwhile, the question of Ukrainian legitimacy remains unresolved and increasingly unavoidable. Governments that suspend elections indefinitely while claiming democratic virtue invite skepticism. The longer this persists, the harder it becomes to argue that Ukraine represents a democratic alternative rather than a managed client state. Russia's insistence on elections is not merely rhetorical, it is a strategic challenge to the moral foundation of Western support. Odessa, in this context, represents more than a military target. It is a psychological and economic hinge. Control over Odessa reshapes the entire Black Sea equation. It affects trade routes, naval posture, and Ukraine's access to the outside world. The gradual isolation of the region through infrastructure degradation signals intent without requiring immediate frontal assault. This is classic operational art: shape, isolate, then decide. At every stage, Russia has paired military pressure with diplomatic signaling. Red lines are stated openly, not obscured. Warnings about escalation are delivered publicly, not through leaks. This transparency contrasts sharply with Western ambiguity, where intentions are cloaked in slogans while capabilities are quietly expanded. One side communicates in strategic language, the other in public relations. Ultimately, the war's persistence reveals a deeper truth about the current international order. The West is not fighting to win Ukraine, it is fighting to delay the acknowledgement of a multipolar reality. Russia, whatever one thinks of its actions, is operating on the assumption that that reality has already arrived. When this conflict ends, and it will not conclude with a triumphant declaration or a clean moral narrative. It will end through exhaustion, recalibration, and the quiet acceptance of facts that were visible long before they were admitted. The tragedy is not that diplomacy failed, but that it was never seriously pursued once it conflicted with the interests of power. To understand NATO's behavior in the Ukraine war, one must stop treating it as a defensive alliance and start analyzing it as a bureaucratic organism whose survival depends on permanent threat. NATO is not merely a collection of member states, it is an institutional ecosystem. Like all such ecosystems, it requires resources, relevance, and justification. Crisis provides all three. When the Cold War ended, NATO lost its original purpose. The Soviet Union dissolved, the Warsaw Pact disappeared, and the existential enemy that justified NATO's scale and structure vanished. Instead of disbanding, NATO reinvented itself. It expanded, not in response to threat, but in search of one. Enlargement became the mission, and expansion itself became the justification for continued existence. This transformation carried a fatal logic. An alliance that expands toward the borders of a former adversary while denying that adversary any security concerns is not a stabilizing force, it is a provocation mechanism. NATO's eastward expansion was not accidental, defensive, or misunderstood. It was deliberate, incremental, and strategically framed to appear non-threatening while steadily altering the balance of power. NATO's internal dynamics reward alarmism. Generals, diplomats, analysts, and contractors rise within the system by identifying threats, not resolving them. A world at peace does not require large standing alliances, massive procurement budgets, or continuous strategic planning exercises. A world on the brink does. Thus, escalation is not a failure of NATO's logic. It is its operating environment. The Ukraine war represents NATO's most successful institutional revival since the Cold War. Budgets have surged. Public skepticism has been muted by fear. Internal divisions have been suppressed under the banner of unity. Member states that once questioned NATO's relevance now treat it as indispensable. From the perspective of the organization itself, the war is not a catastrophe. It is a renaissance. This explains NATO's rhetorical posture. Russia is portrayed not simply as an adversary, but as a civilizational threat, irrational, aggressive, and expansionist. Such framing is essential. A rational adversary can be negotiated with. An irrational one must be contained indefinitely. By denying Russia rational agency, NATO absolves itself of responsibility for escalation while positioning perpetual confrontation as the only option. At the same time, NATO carefully avoids direct accountability. It claims not to be a party to the conflict while coordinating military assistance at an unprecedented scale. It denies involvement while maintaining command structures, intelligence, fusion centers, and logistical hubs directly supporting Ukrainian operations. This ambiguity is intentional. It allows NATO to influence the war without assuming legal or moral responsibility for its outcomes. The organization's leadership reflects this mindset. Statements from NATO officials frequently contradict observable realities, yet they persist because they serve an internal purpose. Claims that Russia is on the verge of collapse coexist with warnings that Russia may attack NATO next. The contradiction does not matter. Both narratives justify continued mobilization. Kaliningrad is a revealing case. Discussions of blockades or containment of the enclave are floated not because they are practical or prudent, but because they test escalation boundaries. NATO probes, watches, reactions, and recalibrates. This behavior is not reckless from the organization's perspective. It is exploratory, driven by a belief that controlled risk is necessary to maintain momentum. What NATO cannot tolerate is resolution. A negotiated settlement that acknowledges Russian security concerns would undermine the alliance's foundational narrative. It would raise uncomfortable questions. Why was expansion pursued so aggressively? Why were diplomatic off-ramps ignored? Why were European societies asked to absorb economic pain for objectives that were never clearly defined? Therefore, NATO's preferred outcome is not victory or defeat, but managed instability. A frozen conflict keeps budgets flowing, command structures relevant, and political alignment enforced. Ukraine becomes less a state and more a strategic terrain, important not for its people, but for its utility. This is why NATO pressures Ukraine to fight on while carefully calibrating what it will not provide enough support to prevent collapse, not enough to force resolution, enough rhetoric to sustain morale, not enough commitment to assume responsibility. It is a cruel equilibrium, but an effective one for institutional survival. In this sense, NATO does not merely respond to crises, it metabolizes them. Crisis is not an aberration, but a nutrient. The longer the war lasts, the more indispensable NATO appears. The more indispensable it appears, the harder it becomes for member states to question its assumptions. And the harder those assumptions become to challenge, the narrower the path to peace grows. This is the paradox at the heart of the Ukraine war. An alliance created to prevent large-scale conflict now depends on its persistence to justify its existence. Until that contradiction is confronted, no amount of diplomacy will be sufficient to end the war. The final reality of this war is not found on the battlefield, but in the asymmetry of agency. The United States and NATO cannot stop the war, Russia does not need to rush to end it, and Ukraine lacks the authority to decide its own fate. This triad explains everything. The United States cannot stop because stopping would require admitting failure, not military failure in the narrow sense, but strategic failure at the level of grand design. Washington invested decades in expanding NATO, restructuring Eastern Europe, and integrating Ukraine into an anti-Russian security architecture. To halt now on terms that acknowledge Russian red lines would invalidate that entire project. It would expose the limits of American coercive power and the hollowness of its credibility guarantees. Beyond prestige, there are material constraints. The American political system has internalized the war, budgets have been allocated, industries mobilized, narratives fixed. Ending the war would disrupt funding streams, provoke congressional conflict, and force a reckoning with why enormous resources produce no decisive outcome. Bureaucracies resist such reckonings instinctively. They prefer continuity, even if that continuity is destructive. NATO, for its part, cannot stop because it has tied its institutional survival to the conflict. The alliance has framed the war as existential, not contingent. If the threat recedes, so does the justification for expanded budgets, forward deployments, and accelerated integration of new members. NATO's leadership understands this. Stability would weaken the organization more than defeat. Russia, by contrast, is under no pressure to hurry. Time works in its favor. Militarily, Russia has adapted its doctrine, scaled production, and stabilized its front. Economically, it has absorbed sanctions and reoriented trade. Politically, it has consolidated domestic consensus around the conflict's necessity. Russia does not require a symbolic victory or a dramatic breakthrough. It requires strategic outcomes. Neutralization of Ukraine as a NATO platform, security guarantees on its borders, and recognition of facts on the ground. Every month the war continues, these objectives become easier to secure, not harder. Ukrainian manpower declines. Western unity frays. European publics grow weary. The cost-benefit ratio shifts steadily. For Russia, patience is not passivity. It is a method. Ukraine occupies the most tragic position of all. It is portrayed as a sovereign actor defending its freedom, yet it lacks sovereignty over the decisions that matter most. It cannot negotiate independently, it cannot redefine war aims, It cannot accept territorial losses or security compromises without external approval. Its leadership survives politically only as long as the war continues and Western support flows. This dependency erodes Ukraine's agency entirely. The country fights, bleeds, and sacrifices, but it does not decide. Strategic decisions are outsourced. Red lines are imposed from abroad. Even the question of elections is subordinated to external calculations. Ukraine exists within the war as terrain, not as an author of its own future. This is why peace initiatives fail, not because proposals are insufficient, but because the actors with agency do not want peace on realistic terms, and the actor that wants survival lacks the authority to choose it. The structure itself blocks resolution. When the war ends, it will not end through a breakthrough negotiation or a sudden moral awakening. It will end when one side can no longer sustain the illusion that continuation serves its interests. For NATO, that moment will come when the costs of permanence outweigh the benefits of relevance. For the United States, when the conflict threatens internal stability more than it reinforces external dominance. Until then, the war persists by design, not by accident. Russia waits because it can. The West continues because it must. Ukraine fights because it is not allowed to stop. That is the cold architecture of this conflict, and understanding it is the first step toward understanding why, for now, it has no ending.